If somebody had told me 25 years ago, when I first entered the world of Jewish learning, that the rabbis were the first humanists, I would have scoffed at them. And I would have thought of it as a kind of appropriation that I was seeing very frequently in the religious world. We've already done this before you have. But I can't really think of a better way of expressing part of the rabbinic enterprise, which doesn't get, it's talked about, but not understood properly or fully. The rabbis are humanists in the same way that Christian humanists, in a parallel way. Christian humanists, the parallel works up to a point. Christian humanists go back to classical Greek and Latin, and they decide, even though it's a foreign culture to them, that they are going to find out the wisdom within it and bring it into their present. The Christian humanists are not frequently enough understood as kind of the real heroes of Western civilization, because they're basically saying, we can go back to another culture. We don't agree with them. In fact, we think they're going to go to hell. That's where Dante puts pagans, right? But with that said, they know a lot. And they really, through reading the Greeks and the Latins, Romans and the Greeks, they make themselves, and not as Romans and Greeks, but as Christian humanists. It's an incredible model. They learn from somebody who believes different things from them. So the rabbis, and you can already see this, the parallel is not exact. The rabbis, they are faced with catastrophe, and the center of Jewish worship in the temple is destroyed. So there's a movement back, really I'll say it in quotes, a movement back to Torah, right? Because the Beit HaMikdash has been destroyed. So now, instead of Torah being used as a manual for practice, I guess, now the rabbis are going back to the Torah and bringing it into history. There really is a shift from an emphasis on space, holy place, to time as holy. And holiness is manifested through reading and interpretation over time. So the rabbis, they by rendering the Torah sacred, and that's what Yochanan ben Zakkai does at Yavna, they canonize different books of the Torah. By rendering it sacred, that act of rendering it sacred authorizes them and renders the rabbinic tradition sacred. Now, of course, unlike the Christian humanist example, there's no conflict between the two perspectives, but there is a going back to this original sacred text, which in some sense, and here's a different parallel also, is unknowable, can't be fully known because it represents the infinite. And because it represents the infinite, it does demand certain kinds of interpretation that never can be fully complete. That's why rabbis are always arguing with each other and even acknowledging the importance of argument. So in this week's Parsha Shavua, V'yigash alav Yehuda is coming close to Yosef. And we know this is like very near the climactic moment. Joseph is going to reveal himself. Yehuda is in a bind. He doesn't want to go back to his father. He doesn't want to be turned into a captive himself. It looks like, really, from his perspective, it looks like the brothers are really in trouble. So V'yigash is interpreted by the rabbis to mean many things. The ones we might be familiar with is he threatened him. I can kill Paro, I can kill you. He pleaded with him. The Medrash takes an opportunity with this V'yigash to think about this relationship in many ways. One of the things it does is says V'yigash, and really it's almost literal. He came close to Yehuda. And in that explanation, the Medrash goes on to say, this is like a case where we see a pool of water, fresh, cool, and we want to drink it, but it's out of our reach. So what do? We get various ropes that are at hand, strings, ropes, whatever we can. We tie them together. We put a deli, a bucket on the bottom of it. And through that, we're able to take out the cool, cold water that was once inaccessible. So the way the Medrash learns is that Yehuda got close to Yosef. They had conversations. They talked. The strings are the way in which Yehuda connects to Yosef. We'll come back to this. There's a similar medrash in Shir Shirim Rabbah, the first parak, the first chapter of Song of Songs, the medrash on it. And there's a whole discussion really of the origin of poetry, where it comes from, when it was allowed. Apparently, the medrash says that before Solomon, the author of Song of Songs, before Solomon, everybody kept God out of fear, and Solomon saw that actually the people needed more. And he then decides that he's going to use proverbs, mashalim, poetry, in order to communicate these things that are infinite. So Solomon decides as much. That's the origin of poetry. And there is a similar scene. There's a cool pool of water, fresh, inviting, but it's inaccessible. And a man comes along and ties together strings of various kinds and various lengths, attaches a bucket to it, and makes the water accessible. That's Solomon. So there, in that case, Solomon is allowing, it is really a moment in literary history that's not acknowledged. The beginning, the first chapter of Shir Shirim Rabbah, of the Song of Songs, it's a defense of poetry, essentially saying poetry can do these things. There, in our case right now, with Torah, I'm getting access to the sacred. The strings in this case are, the Medrash goes on and says, different mashalim, different parables, and they're all connected one to another. And if you connect them all to each other, and if you're a good poet and you know how to think, you're going to get to that infinite. There's a lot more to say about that. But the parallel with Yosef is, and Yehuda and Yosef is, if I get close enough to somebody by talking to them and listening to them, that is the equivalent of the revelation of the sacred. We reveal the sacred in others through conversation. So revelation is a continual state for Jews. There's the revelation at Sinai. There's the continued revelation of interpretation. I'm not arguing, if you're confusing what I'm saying for like the conservative movement, I'm not saying that. I'm saying, though, that the Gemara and the Medrash very often ask us to think of learning and understanding as a form of revelation. There is a Medrash about these four rabbis, and you've never heard of them before. They're like fourth generation Amorai, meaning they're very late in the day. They're unknown, and they're sitting around a campfire, and they're learning Torah, and they're actually only learning halacha. They're going back and forth learning Jewish law, and all of a sudden, there are fireworks. All the things that happened at Sinai happen right there. So Medrash says, and the reason it's where they're rabbis we don't know is because we're not just saying it's the famous rabbis, Rav and Abaya. It's not just them. Even these people, even us. Human revelation. Human revelation begins with the divine. It begins with that divine revelation, that there's a possibility of revelation. It's in a way what the Jews' inheritance is the revelation of revelation. Whenever you hear this, whatever time during the week, Shabbat Shalom.